disease. So record of inoculation against smallpox in Africa goes back as far as the late 17th century, going into the early 18th century. And I have reason to believe, or rather it is believed by many more qualified historians than myself, that practice of smallpox inoculation goes back much, much further in Africa than the late 17th century going into the early 18th century. And the reason I say that is not only because of beliefs that are held by many historians, but also because of the existence of certain deities that you see in certain African groups. One example of that being Sopona or Obaluaye, who is the master of smallpox and basically the master of all infectious diseases. So Sopona is an Orisha, and an Orisha is a deity in the Yoruba spiritual system. And Sopona is basically the god who brings smallpox. If you make a covenant with him and do not honor that covenant, if you do not worship Sopona properly, he might bring smallpox as well. But at the same time, Sopona is also the same person who can take the smallpox away. And there used to be a very strong sort of society of priests and a group of rituals that would be performed by these priests around the deity of Sopona. And when it comes to the inoculation of people against smallpox within the Yoruba Society, the people who are responsible for doing that are the priests of Sopona. And unfortunately, the practice of inoculation against smallpox was eventually stamped out by the British Colonial Administration of Lagos. The practice of inoculation against smallpox by priests of Sopona was basically outlawed in southwestern Nigeria when the British Colonial Administration introduced a law that banned, quote, the worship of smallpox in the Witchcraft and Juju Act of 1917. And the way that these priests would go about inoculating people against smallpox is they would make a small incision in someone's arm, and they would either take pus that came from a pustule, a matured smallpox pustule, and rub it in, or they would take scabs, dried scabs from someone who was a victim of smallpox. They would crush them into a powder, and they would rub that into the open wound of somebody. And it would bring on a much milder version of smallpox within the person who was inoculated, which would typically pass, and then that person would be immunized from smallpox for basically the rest of their life. In the stamping out of the practice of inoculation against smallpox by the British Colonial Administration in 1917, I think it's funny because I have to mention that a year after they stamped out the inoculation of against smallpox by the priests, they themselves introduced a vaccination protocol where they would actually import dried cowpox pus from the UK that they would then use to inoculate people against smallpox, because the practice of using pus from a matured pustule to inoculate somebody against smallpox is a pretty common one, and is one that has been used by pretty much every single group of people since time immemorial.